Remove and replace parts. HP Z6 G5A Workstation Desktop PC. Note: before disassembly, turn off the computer through the operating system. Disconnect the power from the computer by unplugging the power cord from the computer. Disconnect all external devices from the computer. If the computer is on a stand, remove it. How to replace the access panel. Removal. Pull the access panel release latch. Use the access panel release latch to swing the top edge of the access panel away from the computer. Remove the access panel by lifting it straight up. Replacement. Place the access panel guide on the bottom of the chassis. Rotate the access panel up and press to lock into place. How to replace the mid-card retainer. Before you begin, remove the access panel. Removal. Position the access panel upside down. Press the two tabs on the retainer. Rotate the retainer up and remove. Replacement. Align the tabs on the retainer to the recesses on the access panel. Rotate the retainer down and lock into place. How to replace the hard drive. Before you begin, remove the access panel. Removal. Disconnect the hard drive power and data cables from the hard drive. Press in and hold the hard drive carrier release tabs. Remove the hard drive carrier from the computer. Separate the hard drive carrier retention arms from the hard drive far enough so that the pins in the carrier come out of the holes in the hard drive. Remove the hard drive from the hard drive carrier. Replacement. Insert the hard drive into the carrier. Flex the carrier retention arms to insert the pins into the holes in the hard drive. Insert the carrier and hard drive into the hard drive bracket. Reconnect the hard drive power and data cables. How to replace the memory fan assembly. Before you begin, remove the access panel. Removal. Press the two tabs on the side of the memory fan housing toward each other. Remove the memory fan assembly from the computer. Replacement. Align the memory fan assembly tabs to recesses in the chassis. Ensure the memory fan power input aligns with the connector on the system board. Press down to secure the memory fan assembly into place. How to replace the upper PCIe retainer fan assembly. Before you begin, remove the access panel. Removal. Pull the release latch. Rotate the top of the assembly upward. Pull the assembly out of the computer. Replacement. Place the fan assembly tabs into the recesses in the chassis. Rotate the assembly downward and lock into place. How to replace the RTC battery. Before you begin, remove the access panel. Removal. Use a non-metallic, flat-bladed tool to lift the latch to release the RTC battery. Replacement. Slide the RTC battery underneath the latch, then press down to lock into place. How to replace the M.2 solid-state drive. Before you begin, remove the access panel and the upper PCIe retainer fan assembly for SSD 3 and 4. Removal. Slide the release latch back. Grasp the M.2 solid-state drive by the sides, slide it out of the connector on the system board, and remove. Replacement. Insert the M.2 solid-state drive into the connector on the system board. Press down to lock the drive into place. How to replace the system memory, DIMMs. Before you begin, remove the access panel, the memory fan assembly, and the upper PCIe retainer fan. Removal. Release the latches on both sides of the memory slot. Lift the system memory out of the connector on the motherboard and remove. Replacement. Place the system memory into the connector on the system board. Press down on the system memory to lock it into place. How to replace the interlock assembly. Before you begin, remove the access panel and the upper PCIe retainer fan. Removal. Disconnect the interlock assembly cable from the system board. Lift the top of the interlock assembly. Rotate the assembly and remove. Remove the interlock switch from the housing by separating the two tabs and then pulling the switch out of the housing. Replacement. Press the interlock switch into tabs on the housing. Insert the assembly tabs into the holes in the chassis. Rotate upward and lock into place. Reconnect the assembly cable into the system board. How to replace the I/O assembly. Before you begin, remove the access panel, the upper PCIe retainer fan, and the memory fan assembly. Removal. Disconnect the I/O front audio cable from its extension. Disconnect the UI and USB cable from the back of the I/O assembly. Release the I/O assembly by lifting the drive release bar. Remove the I/O assembly from the slot. Replacement. Slide the I/O assembly into its slot. Lift the drive release bar. Push the assembly and lock into place. Reconnect the UI and USB cables to the back of the I/O assembly. Reconnect the I/O front audio cable to its extension. How to replace the optical drive. Before you begin, remove the access panel, the upper PCIe retainer fan, and the memory fan assembly. Removal. Disconnect the power and data cables from the back of the optical drive. Release the drive by lifting the drive release bar. Remove the optical drive from the slot. Replacement. Slide the optical drive into the slot. Lift the drive release bar. Push the drive and lock into place. Reconnect the power and data cables to the back of the optical drive. How to replace the rear fan. Before you begin, remove the access panel and the memory fan assembly. Removal. Disconnect the fan cable from the system board. From the rear of the computer, press the two tabs and rotate the rear fan away from the chassis. Remove the rear fan from the computer. Replacement. Place the rear fan tabs into the holes in the chassis. Rotate and lock the fan in place. Reconnect the fan cable to the system board. How to replace the Flex I/O module. Before you begin, remove the access panel and the memory fan assembly. Removal. Remove the two P1 Phillips head screws. Lift the module to disconnect it from the connector on the system board and remove. Replacement. Align the holes on the module to the mounts on the system board. Press down on the module to reconnect to the system board. Replace the two P1 Phillips head screws. How to replace the upper card guide and fan. Before you begin, remove the access panel, the memory fan assembly, and the upper PCIe retainer fan. Removal. Move the locking bar into the unlocked position. Disconnect the upper front fan cable from the system board. Disconnect the upper auxiliary fan cable from the system board. Press two tabs and rotate the assembly forward. Remove the assembly. Slide the PCIe retainer fan connector and remove. Replacement. Slide the PCIe retainer fan connector into the guides to secure it to the assembly. Place the tabs into the holes in the chassis. Rotate and press the assembly into the front of the chassis to secure. Slide the locking bar into the locked position to lock into place. Reconnect the upper auxiliary fan cable from the system board. Reconnect the upper front fan cable from the system board. How to replace the expansion card. Before you begin, remove the access panel and the memory fan assembly. Removal. Press down on the release tabs at the top of the expansion card bracket to release. Press the expansion card release lever. Lift the card straight up and then away from the inside of the chassis to remove. Replacement. If you are installing an expansion card that is in a location with a slot cover installed, remove the cover by pulling it straight up and away from the inside of the chassis. Align the expansion card to the PCIe connector and slot brace. Press down on the card to reconnect to the system board. How to replace the power supply. Before you begin, remove the access panel, the memory fan assembly, and the upper PCIe retainer fan. Removal. Disconnect the 3 power supply cables from the system board connectors. Loosen the clips securing the cables to the chassis. Remove the cables from the clips. Remove the 4 T15 slotted Torx screws that secure the power supply to the computer chassis. Press and hold the power supply release latch. Slide the power supply toward the front of the computer and remove. Replacement. Place the power supply unit in position on the chassis. Slide the power supply unit towards the rear of the chassis until it locks in place. Replace the 4 T15 slotted Torx screws that secure the power supply unit to the chassis. Guide the cables through the clips. Press the clips to secure the cables. Reconnect the 3 power supply cables to the connectors on the motherboard. How to replace the front bezel. Removal. Position the computer on its right side. Release the 2 tabs on the bottom of the front bezel. Swing the bottom edge of the front bezel away from the computer. Remove the front bezel. Replacement. Align the top of the front bezel to the recesses in the case. Press the front bezel into place working from top to bottom. How to replace the front handle and wireless antennas. Before you begin, remove the access panel, the memory fan assembly, the upper PCIe retainer fan, and the front bezel. Note: if a wireless card is present, disconnect the wireless antennas from the card before proceeding. Removal. Remove the wireless antennas from the routing inside the chassis. Pull the wireless antennas through the hole on the front of the chassis. Remove the antennas from the routing on the front of the chassis. Remove the 2 T15 slotted Torx screws that secure the handle. Pull the handle from the computer and remove. Replacement. Slide the handle into place on the front of the computer. Secure the front handle with 2 T15 slotted Torx screws. Route the wireless antennas through the guides on the front of the computer. Seat the antennas through the hole on the front of the computer. Secure the antennas into place using the routing on the inside of the chassis. How to replace the heatsink. Before you begin, remove the access panel, the memory fan assembly, and the upper PCIe retainer fan. Removal. Disconnect the heatsink fan cable from the system board. In the order indicated on the heatsink, loosen the 4 captive T20 slotted Torx screws. Lift the heat sink off the system board and remove. Replacement. Note: before replacing the heat sink, the thermal grease should be replaced. The thermal grease should be replaced every time the heat sink is removed. Use alcohol and a soft cloth or an alcohol swab to clean all thermal grease from the heat sink and processor. Use the thermal grease applicator to apply the thermal grease to the processor. Place the heat sink in position on the system board. Note: the heatsink has numbers adjacent to the following 4 screws. Tighten the 4 captive T20 slotted Torx screws that secure the heatsink to the system board in numerical order. Reconnect the heatsink fan cable to the system board. How to replace the processor. Before you begin, remove the access panel, the memory fan assembly, the upper PCIe retainer fan, and the heatsink. Removal. Loosen 3 captive T20 slotted Torx screws from processor bracket in reverse numerical order. Rotate the processor bracket up. Lift both blue tabs at the top of the processor frame and rotate the frame up. Slide the processor from the frame to remove. Replacement. Slide the processor into the processor frame. Press down the frame to lock the processor into place. Rotate the processor bracket. Tighten the 3 captive T20 slotted Torx screws that secure the processor bracket in numerical order. How to replace the system board. Before you begin, remove the access panel, the memory fan assembly, the upper PCIe retainer fan, N.2 solid-state drives, rear fan, heat sink, expansion cards, flex IDA module, system memory, and processor. Removal. Disconnect all cables attached to the system board. Remove the 10T15 slotted Torx screws that secure the system board to the chassis. Lift slightly and slide the system board toward the front of the computer. Remove the system board from the computer. Replacement. Gently set the system board into the chassis. Slide the system board toward the rear of the chassis and tow the external connectors into the cutouts. Replace the 10T15 slotted Torx screws that secure the system board to the chassis. Reconnect all cables to the system board. How to replace the VR1 heatsink. Before you begin, remove the access panel, the memory fan assembly, the upper PCIe retainer fan, N.2 solid-state drives, rear fan, heatsink, expansion cards, processor, and system board. Removal. Position the system board upright. From the bottom of the system board, remove the 3 P1 Phillips head screws. Remove the heatsink from the system board. Note the placement of thermal padding on the VR heatsink. Replacement. Gently set the VR1 heatsink onto the system board. Holding the heatsink in place, position the system board upright. Secure the heatsink with 3 P1 Phillips head screws. How to replace the VR2 heatsink. Before you begin, remove the access panel, the memory fan assembly, the upper PCIe retainer fan, N.2 solid-state drives, rear fan, heatsink, expansion cards, processor, and system board. Removal. Position the system board upright. From the bottom of the system board, remove the 2 P1 Phillips head screws. Remove the heatsink from the system board. Note the placement of thermal padding on the VR heatsink. Replacement. Gently set the VR2 heatsink onto the system board. Holding the heatsink in place, position the system board upright. Secure the heatsink with 2 P1 Phillips head screws